Welcome to our webinar today. We're glad to have you join us on our discussion of the EU clinical trial regulation. I am Carol Sue Bernardo. I am the CEO and Managing Director for Xerimis. We are pleased to be entering our 20th year in working with our clients in clinical packaging. We have 3 locations. Our headquarters is here in Morristown, New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia, with a 84,000 square feet GMP facility. In the UK, we are pleased to have our facility just outside of London. That is a 13,000 square foot GMP facility. And our newest location is in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. And that facility is 45,000 square feet and due to open in first quarter 2022. Just some housekeeping things on the webinar today. Tony Molt will be presenting, but the webinar is designed in 2 sections. So we will be entertaining any questions through the live chat, so please feel free to enter your questions, and there will be 2 breaks in which we will be answering those questions for you, one after the first part of the presentation and then at the end of this webinar. And we welcome all questions during this time. And I will turn it over to Tony Molt, who is our interim head of QA in the UK and has a tremendous amount of experience, and I will let him introduce himself to you.
Thank you, Carol Sue. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for sparing the time for joining this webinar and welcome the opportunity to answer some of your questions on the clinical trial regulation in Annex 6 during the webinar in the 2 pauses that Carol Sue's mentioned. I've been working in clinical trials for 35 years now. And even though it's 35 years in the clinical trial environment, it's still a bit of a surprise to find that how long ago it was that I started working on the clinical trial regulation. I had the pleasure of being asked to form a team to respond to the industry's concerns over Annex 6 of the clinical trial regulation and put the industry perspective to the regulators in the European Commission and the European Medicines Agency. And it's very surprising that it was actually 7 years ago that we started to do that work. I'm pleased to say that that team has gone on to review the GMPs associated with the clinical trial regulation, but also it's able to comment on other GMP, IMP issues as well as we move forward. Only 7 years on, it's now time to start preparing for the go live of the clinical trial regulation, which we believe will occur on the 31st of January of 2022. So I'd like to start the formal presentation now, and we can move on to the slides. Next slide, please. The main points of awareness that I'd like you to have from this presentation is that the following items. I'll review these again at the end of the slides, but basically from February of next year, there will be a very different choice of process under which the initial clinical trial application submissions can be made. That will last for a year, and they will have very, very different timelines and technical difficulties associated with them. And I'll go through that during the presentation. Under the new process, however, all EU countries will have clinical sites simultaneously go live after the review of the submission, which will be about 90 days with a range somewhere between 160 and 100 days. And depending on the clinical site initiation policies of the sponsor and IRT management, it's very feasible that under the new process, all EU sites could potentially have a single shipment request to go live overnight. One of the things that is a consequence of Brexit is the UK MHRA will not be part of this regulation, and their approval times will remain as they are, which are approximately 30 days. So it will mean that the MHRA are very much treated differently than EU27. There are consequences with respect to expiry date labelling under the clinical trial regulation in Annex 6, which is why I got involved with the European Commission, EMA, and FPA in the first place. There are also some GMP and GCP interface changes that need to be accommodated in the new clinical trial regulation process. So I'll take you through the slides and cover where those things are clear and try and give you an idea of what the process is. Okay, the clinical trial directive, or the current process under the clinical trial directive, we have to ensure that we submit individually to each member state competent authority the clinical trial application. And separately, we have to submit the individual member states ethical committee process, whether that be a central ethics committee or whether that's a series of local ethics committees, or to use the US term, the IRBs. Now, each member state authorises the trial separately, and that's based on their own regulations, and the regulations of the individual countries are built up as a minimum of the requirements of the clinical trial directive, 20 EC 2012, if my memory serves me correctly, but we call it the clinical trial directive. The difference there is that each member state can have their own individual standards which go above that of the minimum set in the clinical trial directive, and therefore there are sometimes individual differences between a clinical trial in one country and another country in the EU themselves. Approval in one EU country under the current process does not guarantee approval in another. And the process of making up to 27 different submissions and 27 different ethics committee submissions is quite inefficient. Next slide, please. So what is the clinical trial regulation? And going alongside the clinical trial regulation, the clinical trial information system. Well, the clinical trial regulation harmonises the whole process of assessment, approval, supervision and management of the clinical trial, and that is done by submission into the clinical trial information system, the CTIS. They have identical rules throughout the EU for the submission management of the clinical trials through this process. And the CTIS is a database, or used to be called a portal in the early days, in which a single entry point for the EU CTA submissions is made. It's a centralised submission for the process of clinical trials, and it has different dedicated workspaces, some for member states, some from the European Commission, some from the sponsors, and this all allows parallel review of the clinical trial as well as parallel management. There is also access to limited aspects of the clinical trial information for the general public. And this is in response to the general political environment asking for clinical trials transparency. The clinical trial regulation was adopted in April 2014, 7 years ago, but was always conditional to go live on the effective functionality of the clinical trial information system. And that delay of 7 years is primarily because of that clinical trial information system development and other things that have led to it being slow to come on board. Next slide, please. Now, this is a very complicated slide, but it's actually quite simple, really. The clinical trial directive, the blue stream, is what we're operating under now. And if you look at the first part of that blue stream, the blue stream will continue without change, and clinical trial applications will be made up until go live of the clinical trial information system. That's anticipated to be the 31st of January of next year. And from that point on, for a full year, the A section, there is the choice of which system to go by. You can either go the blue system or the green system. After that year, you have to go the green system for any new clinical trial submissions. However, anything entered at the present moment in terms of clinical trial application, and that has been entered up to this point in time, and up to February the 1st, if the clinical trial directive method of submission has chosen, can continue to operate under those rules, regulations, and processes. And that can continue for a further 2 years. After February the 1st, 2025, then all clinical trials in the EU 27 member states have to convert over, if they are to continue, into the EU clinical trial regulation. So let's now look at the green line. The green line started way back in May 2014 and it was entering into legal force in June 2014. But the 7-year gap leading up to where we are now and the red arrow is because of the development of the EU portal and database, the CTIS. Now, that has been long delayed, and there will be questions over, can it get delayed any further? Well, in fact, it has actually had the independent audit performed and accepted by EMA, and therefore there is no reason why the 6-month notice period could not start now. But in order to avoid the year end, EMA have indicated that they're planning for 31st of January 2022 go live. The formal notification is still to happen, but we're not anticipating any problem with that. And that once that formal legal notification has been made in the European Journal, then that will be 6 months before application. So there's very little chance of it having further delays beyond the 31st of January. So we're a real go live now. Despite all the years of when will it happen, I'm reasonably confident that there shouldn't be any more delays and we have to make this thing work. Next slide, please. So really, the clinical trial regulation is a simplification. If you look under the current directive process, diagrammatically, on the left-hand side of this, we had the 10, 12, 14, up to 27 individual national competent authority submissions to the CTA, plus the same number of EU submissions of the Ethics Committee. If you look on the right side of the new regulation, that's one submission for all 27 of a Part 1, and as many Part 2s of submission as you want clinical trials to happen in individual member states. So that's one submission all at once with one Part 1 and many Part 2s. Now, what's in Part 1 and Part 2? If we could look at the next slide, please. The outline of the clinical trial authorization is its one dossier. Only Part 1 has general information, and Part 2 has all the national information that can vary from country to country. So if you look at general Part 1, the things that we're interested in clinical trial supplies are the IMPD, the manufacturing importation, the labelling, the investigator's brochure, and to some extent the classification of the study itself. But normally our studies will be high classification because of IMPs. If you look, however, on the Part 2 side, it's all the things that are appropriate to national laws in the individual countries that can vary depending on legal situation, patients' information, and also the culture of the country with respect to data protection, biological samples, and insurance for compensation. But both Part 1 and Part 2 are submitted at the same time, and that receives the approval to go ahead with the study. Now, if we look at the next slide, please, which has something of the timelines. It's a very complicated slide, but generally speaking, if you look at the part one, there is a lead or rapporteur member state. One member state does all the hard work of reviewing part one. And if it's acceptable, that member state says, yes, I'm happy to go. All the individual part twos are assessed by the individual concerned member states, 1, 10, 20, up to 27 member states. Now, the default for the review by the member states is that they cannot opt out. So there's no reason for them to opt out in issues, generally speaking, in part one. They may have some influence, but they can't really change anything if the rapporteur member state is happy with the process that's going to go forward. Excuse me, my power lead come unattached. The part two, however, is reviewed by the individual member states. Now, there are certain exceptions why they can say, I don't want this study to go ahead like that. The exceptions are on this slide. But basically, their choice is we go ahead or we don't go ahead at all. They can't change things. So generally speaking, you get to the point after all of these different review processes, which can take somewhere between 60 and 102 days in for the total process. My guess is it's going to be around 90 days for the approval for the studies, particularly in the early days. Now, that's quite a long time, but there is a sting in the tail here that you cannot add any new clinical sites or any new countries partway through this process. So it's all or nothing for the initial submission. And that's a significant change in the way the industry works, its recruitment of countries and sites. So this is one of the bigger lessons that I want you to walk away with and learn from this presentation. Next slide, please. At that point, I'm going to take questions on the presentations so far. Carol Sue, are there any questions?
So one question that's come through, Tony, is this similar to a VHP submission?
VHP submission. I'm not sure what that means. I think that might be the centralized submission process. It's very different. It's very different in that the clinical trial regulation all applies when you make the submission. So all the clinical trial regulation goes ahead. Under other centralized submission processes, which have developed over the years to be a little bit like this one, the individual laws for the countries still apply. And that would still be individual countries approving them. So it's not quite the same.
Okay. Another question. If a study is submitted under the clinical trial directive and is still ongoing in 2025, does the sponsor have to submit all relevant information into the CTIS? Or is the sponsor simply obligated to follow the rules set forth in the clinical trial regulation?
This is a very, very big question, and it's resulting in a lot of questions and answers in the industry. The answer is very simple. The sponsor has to force all the different protocols, whether in any variation in any different country, into one design. And that one single design of protocol and part one and part two information is all put into the CTIS as one go. So they have to convert and make the submission into the CTIS and make it fit the new clinical trial regulation. And that is a big concern in the industry. We have some time. 2025 is still some time off, but certainly the question and answers that are available from the EMA on the clinical trial regulation have been dealing with this issue. There is a question and answer paper out on that. But the answer is you have to force everything into fit the same.
A question about member states. Does a concerned member state have the opportunity to deny a study in their country, even if the EC approves the study?
As on the slide, it gave an indication, but it's probably worth talking about that. There's some very, very limited reasons why a concerned member state might say, I don't want this study running in my country. And they can opt out under a very limited number of circumstances. But generally speaking, they are assumed that they will go forward. Now, they have a little bit of influence during the review process. So they may ask for certain tweaks from the rapporteur member state on the study as a whole. But generally speaking, no, they cannot opt out easily. They can opt out a little, but it's a one-shot. They can't change anything.
Okay. What's the best filing strategy if you realize after an initial submission that you already need an amendment?
Don't have one.
Don't have an amendment, you mean?
Correct, don't have an amendment because amendments cannot be made until the initial application has been granted. And that's one of the big things of why you have to get all your clinical sites and all your clinical countries in Go 1. Now, there is opportunity to correct things if the verification of the submission fails or the rapporteur member states ask questions. There are clock stop type operations, but there's no opportunity to put an amendment in partway through.
Okay.
You have to wait for the approval before amendment. And for example, adding new countries, it then starts the clock after the final first approval of between 53 and 80 days. So it's quite a long process to get those amendments through. Right. Get it right first time.
Do the concerned member states and the reporting member state have access to both Part 1 and Part 2, or is access restricted to their sections?
Generally speaking, there's a separation of read-only and management of information into different user groups. I'm not an expert on the actual workings of the CTIS because I've not been one of the member of teams to actually do the pre-testing process. But my best understanding from colleagues that I've got as regulatory colleagues is that they would be able to have read access. They would not necessarily be able to do any writing in the section that they're not allowed.
Who decides which member state will be the lead, the reporting member state?
I don't think it's very clear, but broadly speaking, we think it will be the bigger countries that do the most of the heavy lifting. The countries like Germany, possibly Spain, possibly France, who have bigger ministries of health. And it's down to how many can you handle rather than, I want that one and you can have this one.
Do concerned member states have any influence on the reporting member state decision? If so, what would be next steps?
Well, there's always going to be some degree of feedback. And if there was an obvious error spotted, then that would be an influence. But if it was just personal judgment, there's not going to be too much. And remember, the whole of the EU is operating to the same standards. So some of the differences between one country and another that we see under the Clinical Trial Directive should not exist. It's one rule for all.
Gotcha. We kind of touched on this, but I'll ask it again. I think it's an important piece. If an EU country is added later, the review clock starts at the beginning?
Absolutely. You cannot submit a new country or even a new clinical site, for that matter, until the initial approval is granted. So that's probably going to be around 90 days after the initial submission. And then you start the clock again on the 53 to 80 day timeline. So let's say 60 to 70 days. So that's a long time before you can get an extra site. So it really does change the industry's way of thinking of selection of sites, qualification of sites, and submission of sites in the initial application. And it's a big cultural change.
And so even if a country has been part of the original submission, but now they have another new site they want to add to that country, that requires a new timeline for approval.
Absolutely. My understanding in part 2 is the appropriateness of the site and the investigator's qualifications. So that's not possible to add a new site under part 2 without a new submission.
Mm-hmm. And what happens, you do your submission, study's up and running, but there is a need to add either a country or a site. What happens to what's already been approved and active?
Those will continue to be active, and it will just be an addition, but with the almost punitive timeline.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think it might be a good time to continue on with the presentation.
Well, at this point, I will actually swap the presentation to a video that's associated with the clinical trial Annex 6 labelling concerns that the industry's had. Now, this video is from 2014. The situation hasn't changed, and in the presentation, there's a link to this video for people to look afterwards, but it's worth just playing the video on its own, and then I'll take people through the issues again.
The pharmaceutical industry, represented by FPIA, has been developing innovative approaches for medicines used in clinical trials, and we make great efforts to ensure this process is as safe as possible for patients and efficient. All clinical trial participants get a kit with the trial medicine. Each kit is labelled with retest or expiry date. Companies examine stability data to determine this, in a strictly defined process, according to internationally agreed standards. As additional information is generated about the medicine, this date may be updated. Current EU provisions, EU GMP Annex 13, require retest or expiry date to be displayed on the outer container. They can be omitted from the inner containers if these are too small to contain this information, or if the inner and outer containers are intended to be kept together until use. It is even possible to manage shelf life without any retest or expiry date labeling, using new approaches like interactive response technologies that only make unexpired medicines available to patients. With the evolving stability data, the retest or expiry date needs to be updated. It is important to get this right, and therefore this is done by qualified staff following established procedures at the investigator site, distribution centre, or an authorised packaging facility. Unfortunately, Annex 6 of the new EU clinical trial regulation will require retest or expiry date on all inner containers, without exceptions, posing serious challenges for the integrity of medicines, clinical trial results, and patient protection. Integrity. Opening every outer pack in every site will invalidate tamper evidence. Patients may be concerned if it is broken, or even worse, may conclude broken tamper evidence is a standard. Compliance. Space on inner containers is often limited, and relabeling may not be possible for technical reasons. New stock may therefore be needed, which is wasteful and risks impacting the supply of medication to a trial. Patient safety. In principle, active and placebo treatments must not be distinguished in blinded trials, so there is a high risk of medication being mixed up when manually relabeling inner containers. This could be fatal to a patient. It is for reasons of patient safety and innovation that the research-based pharmaceutical industry, FPIA, calls on the Commission, the Member States and the European Parliament to use the legal mechanisms inbuilt in the clinical trial regulation to update Annex 6 so that current provisions are maintained. These are: to only mandate the application of the retest or expiry date information on outer containers, to allow retest or expiry dates to be omitted on inner containers if these are too small to contain the information, or if the inner and outer containers are intended to be kept together until use. To allow technology, e.g. interactive response technologies and future innovations.
Okay, so that's a video that's been around since 2014, and you can play that video again if you want to from the YouTube link on this slide. And realistically, that just says, even from the early days, the industry is very concerned about moving from the Annex 13 style labelling to Annex 8, and the concerns that has for a number of areas on clinical trial supplies in terms of labelling, and one or two other small things as well. So in terms of preparation for the clinical trial regulation and IMP preparation, there are the label content difficulties. Now, how many trials are going to be affected by this change in expiration date? Well, the estimate is probably 80% of clinical studies will not be badly impacted. 80% of studies will just continue as normal. But there are about 20% of studies where there were mild to significant problems with the Annex 6 requirement for labelling and expiry date in particular. And some of those will need some significant changes to the way the packaging is done, the date extensions are made, or smaller packaging runs, just-in-time techniques, or other labelling techniques need to be designed and built in order to meet the study needs. And they will be very much product specific, they will be very much study specific, and they will obviously be how much of those materials are going into the EU. So that's what the labelling aspects will be. Now, clearly, it needs a little bit more thought on labelling, it needs a little bit more planning, and understanding that data extensions may or may not be necessary. It's very rare that I've heard, oh, we said that we wouldn't need to do a data extension, and we didn't need a data extension. It's very frequently that, oh, we thought we had enough time for the clinical trial supplies to last with the current expiration date, but we found that the recruitment was slower. We found we had to go to different countries, and we find that we do have to do the data extension. And if it's not been planned in from the start, Annex 6 makes this much more difficult than it was originally. Next slide, please. Now, there are some additional things about the clinical trial regulation, and to some extent, other things that have gone alongside that have impact on the trial master file. Well, the trial master file doesn't normally worry clinical supplies people too much, but there are some new stings in the tails there. And it's driven by a couple of things. The clinical trial regulation of 536/2014, and this is reinforced by GMP guidance and standards set by the new ICH GCP revision. And that means that GMP records and TMF records have very different retention periods expected. The trial master file retention period is now going to be set at 25 years after the end of the clinical study for anything submitted under the new regulation. That's a long time. Contract manufacturers, however, operate to pretty much standard GMP retention times related to clinical trials, and typically are 5 years after the end of the clinical trial. So there's a big gap there between TMF expectations and the GMP standard retention times. And that's made it a little bit worse because the GCP ICH E6 revision 2 sets a standard for copies in the TMF. And that standard is set as certified copies of or the originals are captured via a validated system, e.g. an eTMF or electronic trial master file. Now, the sponsor defines the documents that are needed in the TMF, but the current expectations, according to the TMF content guidelines, are that it will include packaging batch records, among other things. So whilst the people like Xerimis and contractors commit to GMP timelines, the sponsors must define if and what TMF elements Xerimis records exist and how they will be handled. We will maintain the GMP timelines expected, but if the sponsors require it, that it is TMF content, then they're going to have to tell us how to capture it in the TMF, whether it be certified copies or whether it's the original after a retention period. But most of our recent QTAs have started to deal with this. But the sponsor or client, as your case, must define on a proposal or study by study basis the requirement of how we handle TMF and what is TMF content from the very beginning. And clearly there are going to be some cost implications there. Next slide, please. So, as a recap of all the main points before going to question and answers. From February 2022, there's two very different processes that you have a choice of, with very different timelines and different technical abilities. So, as clinical trials supplies people, you have to be thinking alongside other colleagues and team members in the clinical development team, who will make the decision of which path to go, the green path or the blue path, which studies will initially be put onto the new path, and have you got the design of your clinical supplies as well as TMF ready for that process. All EU countries under the clinical trial regulation will go live after 90 days approximately, 60 to 106. That's a long review period. So get it right first time, make sure we got everything, and make sure that submission is correct. And depending on the site initiation policies, if they need IMP or don't need IMP for site initiation, how the IRT is managed, there is a potential for all EU sites to have a shipment request overnight. Now, no depot in the world will be able to do 200 shipments unexpectedly on the next morning. So please understand the bolus effect that potentially could have. And if the clinical site initiation is well planned and rolling, make sure the IMP plans harmonize with it and roll as well to give you the best service possible. Please remember, the UK is not part of this regulation, and approval times will be around what they are now. So that might have a double-edged sword effect. If, for whatever reason, you want to get a site up and running because of potential stock market issues or potential good publicity issues, the UK will probably be the first European site to go to because it will start the study site up quickly. That will have an implication on how your supplies are planned. There will be also consequences with respect to expiry date labeling if your product and your study have difficulties with respect to the placement of a data extension, whether it's a kit, whether it's a single bottle, or whether it's frozen or even minus 80 degrees centigrade. Doing data extensions at minus 80 degrees centigrade is not possible. The labels fall off. And there are some GMP, GCP changes that need to be accommodated. Now, we will lead our clients on that within our quality technical agreements and make sure that the things that Xerimis will do will be transparent, but there needs to be an understanding of your TMF policy, what you consider to be TMF content, and how you're going to get that into your electronic trial master file if that's the route you choose. So at that point, Carol Sue, can I take any additional questions?
So one question that came up was, when an amendment like change to the or update to the IMPD is needed, will the criteria for substantial versus non-substantial amendments change or stay the same?
The non-substantial and substantial amendment guidance was updated, ready for the clinical trial regulation, and that is in the EMA website. So it will very much depend on what the amendment is. There is a much better guidance for non-substantial and substantial, and that rule for substantial and non-substantial will be one off for the whole of the EMA, for the whole of the EU. So that
Gotcha.
guidance is in the Eurodrex website under volume 10, and there is two sections there. There's a section that deals with the clinical trial directive as it is. If you click on that, you can see all the regulations and guidance there. But if you click on the 536 2014, then the updated IMPD submission expectations are in there. And that was updated approximately 2017, ready for the clinical trial regulation.
Very good. Part 2 is primarily GCP, whereas Part 1 has GMP sections. Is this the same breakdown as is currently found in the clinical trial directive?
No. You have to consider Part 1 as being general material and all trial material that doesn't vary per member state. But Part 2 is not GCP. It is national law and how that varies, such that appropriate data protection, appropriate insurance, and all those things that are associated with nationalistic aspects of patients in terms of rights of data, rights of biosamples, which change from country to country. Those are the things that are in Part 2. They're not split by GMP and GCP. They're general versus national.
Gotcha. Can you elaborate on the timing of the review period?
Well, there is actually quite a good paper that I would recommend people looking at. And that was published in the ISPE in March, April 2017. And if you look it up on Google, you'll find that under EU clinical trial regulation application process. But basically, it's a multi-stage thing, and it's going to take somewhere between 60 and 102 days. But I would guess it's going to be nearer the 90 days. I don't think there'll be much change from the worst case situation in terms of the review. So realistically, it is what it is, but you get all countries and all sites that go at one go.
Mm-hmm. TMF is 25 years. How long are the GMP timelines again?
The current GMP timelines are 5 years from the end of the study, and that will be the same under the new GMP regulation. The GMP regulation you will find in volume 10, as I said, and that currently maintains the same 5 years from the end of the study.
Okay. What is the latest update?
However,
on
that I would just add an extra. If you look at the guidance that was issued, the replacement for Annex 13, which again is in that thing, it does advise to watch out for the 25 years, even in the GMP guidance. So it does acknowledge this overlap between some TMF content that's in manufacturers and some TMF content that's more related to the sponsor.
Gotcha. What is the latest update on FBA's efforts to change the labeling regulations?
That's an interesting one. One of the challenges is there is the ability to change Annex 6, but that legal ability to change Annex 6 doesn't kick in until it goes live. So even when it goes live, when it goes live, they can start to consider changing. Now, there is a groundswell of understanding that Annex 6 is too much tighter than Annex 13. And there is some movement in competent authorities that's saying, well, really, we should have just maintained Annex 13. But it's going to take a lot of push to make that change. So realistically, people have to plan with Annex 6 going live as it is. You've got to assume it won't change. FPA have put in the public domain a paper on risk assessment and how it might be mitigated. So I would look out for that paper. And basically, the alignment of trying to get the change is still there. It's still happening, but it's very difficult to make that happen before it goes live. It's impossible legally to make it happen and go live. So FPA and the national trade associations in Europe are still pushing to try and get that changed. One or two of the competent authorities have a sympathetic ear, but once it's in paper, it's very difficult to change. So plan for the worst, hope for the best.
Right. And a final question. If the CTIS planned go live date slips again and comes online on a date after January 2022, how long after that date will the regulation become applicable?
The CTS is ready to go live. It's been tested, it's been audited. So the clock starts of go live when that is published in the European Official Journal. Now, I anticipate it will be published at the end of July to give the exact 6 months to the 31st of January. Is that going to happen? 98% probability.
So
it's an administrative thing.
And so would a date to keep an eye on would be July 31st?
If it's not by July 31st, is it getting delayed?
Yes. So there will be some kind of notification, or we'll know that it's go live and here we go.
That 6 month notification has to happen. It's formal, but it has to officially happen. And at 98% probability it will.
Right. So that's a key date for everyone to look at. So go ahead.
Well, are there any more questions after that?
That is the last of our questions. I thank you for presenting today and sharing your knowledge and experience with the registrants today. I thank the registrants for participating in our webinar. Our hope is that this information was not only interesting, informative, but also useful to you. And we look forward to having other webinars available to you in the future. So stay tuned and thank you for your participation.